What happens when a budget hearing stops being about numbers, stops being about policy, and turns into a full-scale political street fight? That is exactly what unfolded in Washington when veteran Democratic Congresswoman Rosa DeLauro clashed with EPA Administrator Lee Zeldin in a confrontation that quickly exploded across the internet. Within hours, conservatives were calling it a total takedown. Critics were accusing the White House of crossing a line, and what should have been a debate over climate policy became something much bigger, a window into how American politics now works in the age of viral outrage. So in this video, we are not just going to replay the shouting match. We are going to unpack what really happened, why Lee Zeldin kept invoking a Supreme Court case called Loper Bright, why Rosa DeLauro matters far beyond one heated moment, and why this clash tells us something important about where the United States is heading on climate, regulation, and political culture. Because this was not just theater. It was a battle over who gets to define the limits of government power in America. The confrontation happened during a congressional hearing over the EPA's 2027 budget request. DeLauro, the ranking member on the House Appropriations Committee, blasted the budget proposal as sounding like, quote, a climate change deniers manifesto, and demanded to know how the agency could justify backing away from what she sees as its duty to protect Americans from the real-world effects of climate change, flooding, air pollution, and rising health costs. Zeldin responded by arguing that the EPA does not simply get to define its own mission however it wants, and then he pivoted into a legal challenge that completely changed the temperature in the room. According to Fox News, Zeldin pressed DeLauro on whether she was familiar with Loper Bright and what he called the major policy doctrine, framing the disagreement not as a dispute over science, but as a dispute over statutory power. DeLauro pushed back, insisting the administration had no right to act as if climate change was a hoax, and at one point reminded Zeldin that he was sitting before Congress because he needed funding from lawmakers. The exchange went viral almost immediately because it had everything modern political media rewards: legal jargon, moral outrage, personal tension, and a made-for-social media punchline. The New York Post highlighted an additional flashpoint later in the hearing, reporting that a discussion touching on glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup weed killer, turned into another sharp exchange. Now, if you only encountered Rosa DeLauro through that viral clip, you might think she is just another loud congressional personality. But that misses the real story. DeLauro is not a backbencher looking for a moment. She has represented Connecticut's 3rd congressional district since 1990, serves as the ranking member of the House Appropriations Committee, and also holds a major role on the Labor, Health and Human Services, and Education Appropriations Subcommittee. In plain English, she is one of the Democrats most deeply involved in deciding where federal money goes. That matters, because when someone like DeLauro speaks, she is not just making noise. She is signaling where part of the Democratic establishment wants federal power and federal funding to move. And just days before this hearing went viral, DeLauro was at the University of New Haven promoting the SOAR Act, a proposal designed to expand income-driven repayment options for student loan borrowers. There, she framed education as the pathway to the American dream and argued that borrowers need a clearer path out of debt and into wealth building. University officials backed the idea by stressing that many students rely on financial aid and that flexible repayment can strengthen both individual futures and the economy. That is important because it shows the contrast between DeLauro's policy identity and her viral identity. One is about slow, technical, domestic policy. The other is about spectacle. In 2026 Washington, the spectacle almost always travels farther. So what exactly was Lee Zeldin doing when he kept bringing up Loper Bright? This is where the story becomes bigger than one hearing. In Loper Bright Enterprises versus Raimondo, the U.S. South Supreme Court overruled the old Chevron doctrine, which for decades had told courts to defer to reasonable agency interpretations when federal laws were ambiguous. The new rule is very different. Judges are now expected to use their own independent judgment to decide what a statute means, rather than automatically deferring to agency expertise. That is a major shift in the balance of power between the bureaucracy and the courts. For agencies like the EPA, this is not an academic law school debate. It changes the rules of the game. Under the old Chevron framework, agencies often had more room to interpret broad laws and defend those interpretations in court. After Loper Bright, agencies face a tougher legal landscape because courts are less likely to say, well, the agency is the expert, so we'll let it decide. Instead, judges now ask what they believe the best reading of the law is. That makes every major regulation more vulnerable to challenge. So when Zeldin invoked Loper Bright, he was essentially saying, the EPA cannot simply act on broad climate ambitions unless Congress has clearly empowered it to do so. Supreme Court of the United States, the Congressional Research Service explains that Loper Bright may also preserve, or at least overlap with, the so-called major questions doctrine. That doctrine says agencies should not assume they can regulate issues of vast economic and political significance unless Congress has clearly said so. This is crucial because climate policy is exactly the kind of area where courts may now demand more precise authorization. So beneath the shouting match, there was a serious constitutional and institutional conflict playing out. DeLauro was arguing from urgency and public harm. Zeldin was arguing from statutory restraint and judicially enforced limits. And remember, this was all happening in the context of a massive proposed cut to the EPA. Fox News reported that the agency received roughly $8.82 billion in fiscal 2026, while President Trump's request for 2027 was about $4.2 billion, around a 52% reduction. Search results tied to the official EPA budget summary likewise described a proposed 2027 budget total of roughly $4.203 billion, also identifying it as a 52% decrease. That is not trimming around the edges. That is an attempt to redefine what kind of agency the EPA is allowed to be. To critics of the administration, that budget is a direct signal that environmental protection is being downgraded in favor of deregulation and narrower statutory interpretations. To supporters, it is a long overdue correction against what they see as mission creep, overregulation, and a bureaucracy that has used vague laws to expand its reach. That is why the hearing mattered. It was not simply about whether two politicians dislike each other. It was about whether environmental governance in the United States is entering a new era where agencies are smaller, more cautious, and more constrained by courts than they have been in decades. Then the story took another turn. After Zeldin posted about the exchange on X, saying that an uninformed congressional Dem had self-imploded, the official White House account piled on with a comment aimed not at policy, not at law, but at Rosa DeLauro's appearance. Terrible take. Even worse hair. The Daily Beast reported that this came on the same day White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt was publicly condemning hateful and violent rhetoric against President Trump after an attempted attack tied to the White House Correspondents' Dinner. That contrast, condemning ugly rhetoric while engaging in personal mockery, became a story in itself. This matters because modern politics is no longer just about governing or even messaging. It is about domination of the attention economy. A hearing clip is not complete until it becomes a meme. An official White House account is not just an institutional voice anymore. It can function like a partisan influencer account. The Daily Beast article placed that comment in the broader context of Trump-era communications, including prior insults directed at women and a pattern of provocative social media behavior by official accounts. Whether one sees that as authentic, brutal honesty or as a degradation of public standards, it shows how power is now exercised not only through law and budgets, but through humiliation and virality. But here is where this story gets more interesting. Rosa DeLauro is not just some random target for online mockery. In April 2026, she was also publicly pressing House leadership to end what she called the third Republican shutdown of the year by bringing a Senate-passed Homeland Security funding bill to the House floor. In that letter, she argued that the fastest way to ensure pay for personnel across the Secret Service, Coast Guard, FEMA, TSA, and CISA was for the Speaker to stop delaying and allow a vote. She said the shutdown had already stretched 72 days since February 14th and cited a $10 billion fund that the administration had been using to keep DHS personnel paid, warning that without action, workers could miss a paycheck beginning May 22nd. That is a reminder that DeLauro operates at the intersection of message politics and governing mechanics. And there is another example. A Connecticut delegation press release announced that John Larson, Rosa DeLauro, and Joe Courtney welcomed a $369 million Navy contract modification for Pratt and Whitney to support construction of 138 new F-135 engines in East Hartford and Middletown over the next 5 years, following a much larger $3.8 billion contract modification earlier that month. That is local jobs, defense manufacturing, industrial capacity, and allied military capability all rolled into one. So when viewers see DeLauro only through the lens of one shouting match, they miss the fact that she is also tied to student debt policy, homeland security funding fights, and the military-industrial base that supports the F-35 program. And that is why this story matters beyond Washington gossip. What happened in that hearing reflects 3 major shifts in American politics at the same time. First, legal power is moving. Courts are taking a more assertive role in policing agencies after Loper Bright. Second, executive agencies are becoming ideological battlegrounds, especially on climate and environmental enforcement. And third, political communication is becoming more openly performative, more personal, and more geared toward instant online tribal reward than persuasion. There is also an international angle here. If the United States sharply narrows the EPA's reach while courts constrain agency flexibility, that affects how America approaches global climate commitments, industrial standards, energy policy, and credibility with allies. And when a veteran appropriator like DeLauro is simultaneously defending environmental regulation, pressing for student loan relief, fighting over homeland security funding, and supporting F-35 engine production in Connecticut, you can see how messy the real map of U.S. politics has become. It is not left versus right in a neat, clean way. It is law versus urgency, institutions versus performance, domestic industry versus regulatory expansion, and public policy versus viral politics. So was Lee Zeldin exposing a lawmaker who was unprepared for the new legal landscape after Loper Bright? Or was Rosa DeLauro sounding the alarm about an administration using legal doctrine and budget cuts to weaken environmental protections in the middle of a climate crisis? The answer, depending on your politics, will be completely different. But one thing is clear, this was not just a viral hearing clip. It was a preview of the next phase of American governance, where judges have more power, agencies have less room, politicians perform for the algorithm, and every public argument is instantly converted into ammunition for a larger cultural war. And that may be the real headline here. Not that 2 people in Washington yelled at each other, but that the United States is rewriting the relationship between politics, law, and bureaucracy in real time. And it is doing it in front of cameras, on social media, and in a political culture that increasingly rewards spectacle over substance. If you want to understand where America is going next, do not just watch the insults. Watch the institutions. Because behind every viral moment, there is usually a deeper power shift underway.